Our 3-year lectionary cycle gives us a different resurrection account each year. Every year we have one of the 3 synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, or Luke, plus we always get John's version to accompany them. And all 4 gospels tell us that Mary Magdalene was the first witness to the resurrection. But there are striking differences. John is the only author who writes that Mary was initially alone, then reached out to the disciples, then was left alone again before she saw angels and then Jesus. John is also the only author who tells his story in the dark. Matthew says, as the first day of the week was dawning. Mark says, and very early, when the sun had risen. Luke says, on the first day of the week, at early dawn, they came to the tomb. But for John, it was still dark when Mary came to the tomb. John is also the only author who tells us that Mary is in tears. Her weeping is mentioned 4 times by the narrator, by the angels, and by Jesus himself. So John's story shows us a woman who is alone, who is abandoned by the disciples, who is weeping in the dark. And there resurrection happens, or at least reveals itself. This Mary shows us the way to Jesus is in the dark, alone, consumed by grief. And yet sorrow is not her only emotion. She is also outraged, angry, and her anger gives her courage. When she sees that the tomb is unsealed, she must assume the worst. She knows that the sacrilege of grave robbing happens, or perhaps even more sinister, the desecration of a tomb for political ends. She assumes the worst, but is willing to fight for her beloved to the end, to her end, since his end has already come. But where is the body? She runs to find Peter and the other disciple, and they come, but then they leave, not sharing any revelation they may have had, not asking her if she wants to come with them. And so she stays, weeping. Mary is the perfect combination of heartbreak and outrage, sorrow and anger. Grief ties her to the grave. Anger gives her courage to fight for what is right. And in this mixture of emotions, she dares to look inside the tomb, and the angels reveal themselves to her. But it's still not good enough for her. She wants to know, where is her beloved's body? And Jesus comes to her. But she is still stuck on her quest. She can't recognize him until he calls her name. And as soon as she hears his voice, she can see him for who she is, for who he is, and she reaches out to touch him. And in one of the more obscure parts of the text, he tells her not to. His resurrection body is not yet complete. He needs to ascend, to let the flesh become the Word, just as the Word became the flesh in the beginning. But before he ascends, he commissions. Jesus sends Mary to go and share the good news, to go to the disciples and tell them that Jesus ascends to the Father, to his Father and their Father, his God and their God. And so Mary's grief becomes a vehicle for grace. I was reminded of English poet Christina Rossetti, who struggled with illnesses throughout most of her life. She was first diagnosed with a heart disorder when she was only 15 years old and was sickly until her death at 64. She became deathly ill at 40 from Graves' disease and battled breast cancer in the last couple years of her life. But even though she was battling illnesses most of her adult life, it didn't stop her from writing. I want to share with you a poem she wrote when she was 27 called A Better Resurrection. And I want you just to note there are 3 stanzas, and in each stanza a little bit more hope rises. I have no wit, no words, no tears. My heart within me, like a stone, is numbed too much for hopes or fears. Look right, look left, I dwell alone. I lift mine eyes, but dimmed with grief, no everlasting hills I see. My life is like the falling leaf. O Jesus, quicken me. My life is like a faded leaf, my harvest dwindled to a husk. Truly my life is void and brief and tedious in the barren dusk. My life is like a frozen thing. No bud nor greenness can I see. Yet rise it shall, the sap of spring. O Jesus, rise in me. My life is like a broken bowl that cannot hold one drop of water for my soul, or cordial in the searching cold. Cast in the fire the perished thing, melt and remold it, till it be a royal cup for him, my King. O Jesus, drink of me. What is it about illness or grief or struggle that can become an opening for grace? Because it is certainly not always true. Pain and suffering and sorrow can also close us down, lead us to shrink into ourselves, cut ourselves off from the world, from God. But sometimes sorrow can become a gift, drawing us forward, opening us up to new possibilities, new relationships, new understandings. It can give us new eyes to see and new compassion for others. As we continue to experience this difficult and frightening COVID-19 pandemic, our church buildings stand empty. And some of my colleagues, not in the United Church, but elsewhere, have said that they will celebrate Easter only when we are allowed to gather again. Whatever that date, they say, that will be Easter, and we will celebrate resurrection together. Now, I have no problem with celebrating the resurrection at any time. After all, every Sunday is supposed to be a mini Easter, even through penitential seasons like Lent. But the idea of holding off on an Easter celebration just because we are stuck indoors and physically distanced from each other? No, I can't do that. Because what could be more appropriate than celebrating Easter now? In our aloneness, in our grief and anger and worry, in what to many seems like a dark and fearful time. We are standing with Mary Magdalene. The resurrection is good news because it speaks so clearly to the powers and systems that would keep us fearful, encourage us to be self-centered and pursue our own wants and desires while ignoring the needs of the poor and oppressed. Jesus' life, his ministry, his death, revealed the kingdom to us, showed us God's love and justice in action. The powers that be reacted with cruelty and violence, tried to blot out not just the man, but everything he stood for. They tried to destroy his legacy and convince his followers to abandon all that he had taught them. But God had the last word. and still has. Resurrection is real, love triumphs over death, and Mary's anger and sadness are turned into purpose and joy. May it be so for us, even now, in our isolation and fear, in our anger and sadness, in our worry and loneliness. May we still find ourselves commissioned to spread words of love and hope, to take actions that protect the most vulnerable, and reach out to a hurting world. Christ is risen. Hallelujah. Amen.